Good evening, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Deputy Director of Events at Politics and Prose, and I just want to welcome you all to tonight's PNP Live event. Just a few things to go over with you before we begin. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button below to purchase either book straight from PNP's website. And a reminder that we're offering $5 flat rate shipping on all orders. So no matter what you add to your cart or how many books you buy, you will pay the same price for shipping. You can also ask either of our authors a question by clicking on Ask a Question, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And you can even vote for questions you'd like to hear answered the most after reading through what other attendees have asked. Finally, and most importantly, both Politics and Prose and tonight's authors are sickened by the police brutality and racial injustice that is plaguing our country. As a response, Megha and Pam want to acknowledge the importance of not just reading and education, but of direct action. If you're able, we encourage you to donate to Act Blue, an organization that splits donations between community bail funds, mutual aid funds, and racial justice organizers. We've dropped the link to donate in the chat, and we will drop it again as the event goes on. And if you're unable to contribute, we understand, but we hope that you will continue to amplify Black voices, read Black authors, and work to promote anti-racism in your everyday life. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's authors. First, Megha Majumdar is an editor at Catapult and the author of A Burning, a novel about three unforgettable characters who seek to rise to the middle class, to political power, to fame in the movies, and find their lives entangled in the wake of a catastrophe in contemporary India. Additionally, Pam Zhang is the author of Much of These Hills is Gold, a novel that follows Lucy and Sam, newly orphaned children of immigrants, and explores the memories that bind and divide families and the yearning for home. So now please help me welcome to PNP Live, Megha and Pam. Hi, guys.
Hi, thank you, Brittany. Hey, Pam.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to disappear and have a great event.
Thank you, Brittany.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, Megha. It's so good to see your face.
It is so good to see you. I'm so excited to chat about your beautiful book.
My copy didn't that sadly, but I'm really patient for the mail.
So I know that how you and I were thinking about this is we would each read for a few minutes and then just do a Q&A. And I guess one way to start, which I know you and I discussed, I know that we're both following the news and paying close attention to what's happening. I guess I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that I'm sure there are people in the room who are bringing anger and sorrow and grief with them. And I just wanted to say that if this hour of talking provides some comfort or some energy or fuel to you, then I will be very glad.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And same, Megha. I know, to be very honest with everyone who showed up, I know both Megha and I struggled with the correctness of even having an event like this devoted to literature that isn't, as Brittany sort of mentioned in her opening comments, about taking direct action. And I know that I personally, as a writer coming out with a book, not just among the protests that are happening right now, but a couple of months ago with all of the pandemic, have just struggled with the question again and again of why art and writing matters. I don't know that I have a perfect answer for any of you in the room, though I'm sure many of you have that same question has crossed your minds at different points. And I think this is not a perfect answer and it will probably change. But for me, I think both are important. Obviously, we need to take direct action, but I do think it is also important to nourish our minds. It is also important to find places where you see your joy, but also I think you'll see, as Megha and I discuss our books, also our pain and our sorrow reflected in literature, and sort of use that to go back to the world around you, energized in some way or understanding things in a different light. So that's all I wanted to say before the event begins. But please do donate to Act Blue. It's a really great organization. As Brittany said, it splits donations, which is something that I know was really helpful for me when I found that organization, being as right now it feels like sometimes it can be overwhelming to know where to give your aid, but this is going directly to bail funds across different organizations nationwide. So, yeah.
Should we dive into readings, Pam?
Yes,
Did you want to go first? Or?
Are you going first? I actually wanted to hear your book, Megha. It's Megha's launch week, for anyone who doesn't already know that, and I really want to hear your book.
Okay, all right, I'll go first. So I'll read just a little bit from A Burning. And because I'm reading from the beginning, you don't need to know anything, and I'll keep it very short. You smell like smoke, my mother said to me. So I rubbed an oval of soap in my hair and poured a whole bucket of water on myself before a neighbor complained I was wasting the morning supply. There was a curfew that day. On the main street, a police jeep would creep by every half hour. Daily wage laborers, compelled to work, would come home with arms raised to show they had no weapons. In bed, my wet hair spread on the pillow. I picked up my new phone, purchased with my own salary, screen guard still attached. On Facebook, there was only one conversation. These terrorists attacked the wrong neighborhood. The more I scrolled, the more Facebook unrolled. The night before, I had been at the house. I ought to have seen the men who stole up to the open windows and threw flaming torches into the halted train. But all I saw were carriages burning, their doors locked from the outside and dangerously hot. Fire spread to huts bordering the station, smoke filling the chests of those who lived there. More than 100 people died. The government promised compensation to the families of the dead, 80,000 rupees, which, well, the government promises many things. In a video, to the dozen microphones thrust at his chin, the chief minister was saying, "Let the authorities investigate." Somebody had spliced this comment with a video of policemen scratching their heads. It made me laugh. There's a siren in my neighborhood. Can you hear it?
I can, but it actually only adds to the ambient.
Oh my God. Okay, I'll keep going then.
Keep going, please.
I admired these strangers on Facebook who said anything, making jokes. Whether it was about the police or the ministers, they had their fun, and wasn't that freedom? Then in a video clip further down the page, a woman came forward, her hair flying, her nose running, her eyes red. She was standing on the sloping platform of our small railway station, and into the microphone she screamed, "There was a jeep full of policemen right there. Ask them why they stood around and watched while my husband burned. He tried to open the door and save my daughter." I shared that video. I added a caption. "Policemen paid by the government watched and did nothing while this innocent woman lost everything," I wrote. I laid the phone next to my head and dozed, the heat to my eyes. When I checked my phone next, there were only 2 likes. A half hour later, still 2 likes. Under my thumb, I watched post after post about the train attack earn 50 likes, 100 likes, 300 likes. Nobody liked my reply. And then, in the small glowing screen, I wrote a foolish thing. I wrote a dangerous thing, a thing nobody like me should ever think, let alone write. Forgive me, Ma. If the police didn't help ordinary people like you and me, if the police watched them die, doesn't that mean, I wrote on Facebook, that the government is also a terrorist? I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Megha. Absolutely enthralling. I know I got the chance to read an advanced copy of Megha's book, and I finished it literally on one plane ride. It just kept me wrapped the entire time. So highly encourage people to get it.
Thank you, Pam.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to read very briefly from How Much of These Hills is Gold. Brittany gave the brief description earlier, and I'm going to be reading from a passage more in the center of the book. And really all you need to know is this is a critical point in which Lucy, one of the two child protagonists, and her family have just discovered gold. And gold in this book, in the sort of gold rush inspired setting, is kind of the stand-in for the American dream. And she is at this moment reflecting on all that means for her and for the place that they live. Because this land they live in is a land of missing things, a land stripped of its gold, its rivers, its buffalo, its Indians, its tigers, its jackals, its birds, and its green and its living. To move through this land and believe Ba's tales is to see each hill as a burial mound with its own crown of bones. Who could believe that and survive? Who could believe that and keep from looking, as Ba and Sam do, always toward the past, letting it drag behind them, letting it make them into fools? And so Lucy fears that unwritten history. Easier to dismiss all Ba's tales as tall ones, because believe in where does it end? If she believes that tigers live, then does she believe that Indians are hunted and dying? If she believes in fish the size of men, does she believe in men who string up others like linefuls of catch? Easier to avoid that history, unwritten as it is, except in the soughing of dry grass, in the marks of lost trails, and the rumors from the mouths of bored men and mean girls, and the cracked patterns of buffalo bones. Easier by far to read the history that Teacher Lay teaches, those names and dates orderly as bricks, stacked to build a civilization. Still, Lucy never quite escapes that other, the wild one. It prowls the edges of her vision, an animal just beyond the campfire's glow. That history speaks not in words, but in roar and beat and blood. We'll stop there.
Pam, oh my God. Your sentences are so beautiful. Can I sneak in a question and ask you, you're such a beautiful, where do these sentences come from for you, and how do you polish them?
Two very separate questions. Also, just because he's here and I just read about tigers, I have to say my cat is on the screen, so anyone who needs to see a cat today, here he is. So I think the answer to that is twofold, and I actually want to hear the same for you, Megha. But like the first impulse of the sentences is that I don't plan any works. They just, an image and sort of like a sonic phrase comes to me, and I just like go from there. When I was writing this book, I think some of the sort of like swing and rhythm of the sentences came, one, from trying to evoke this sort of cowboy poetry of the Old West, which is like very, very enjoyable to read. But then also for me, mix in two things that were important to this book. And one is there are sprinkled throughout the dialogue and the text little bits of Pidgin Mandarin, which is the family's second language, and that inflects the rhythm of the sentences. And then two, the other thing is that there's a character in the book who would today probably identify as trans or gender non-conforming. And so I sort of set this fun artistic constraint for myself at the beginning, which was to avoid the use of gendered pronouns for the first like 15 or so pages, in order to let this character sort of present themselves without being labeled and judged first. And so that's the fun process. Revision is the much slower process that usually involved me reading everything out loud, recording it, and then playing it back to myself. But yeah, I'm curious to where your book and your revision process come from, Megha.
I love what you said about the Mandarin phrases, because even though I didn't include any Bengali phrases in A Burning, Bengali is my mother tongue. And I really hope that some of the tenderness and pathos and richness of Bengali crept into the language here. Yeah, for me, I think so much of the book, it began from this place of wanting to respond to the right wing, and to the ascendance of the right, and see how individuals are able to move forward and dream and laugh and fall in love in these oppressive conditions. But like, in terms of sentences, I think they often came from this place of high emotion, like this register of like just high emotion, like love between a mother and a child or something like that. And then I would just kind of have to like flesh it out and let it become narrative from just like this ball of emotion.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about for you, Megha, your book has many voices. There are three main ones. But I wonder for you, and what's really cool about them is they all, and I think especially the voice of Lovely, have a very particular cadence. They sound, like different people. And so what was that like for you in terms of process, your ability to one, like create these voices, but then two, to sort of switch between them so that they don't just blend into one?
Um, so Lovely is this character who goes from the very margins of society, to she chases this dream of becoming a movie star, which is, the wildest possible dream you can have in this society, and who is struggling to learn English. So in her voice, I really wanted to have that feeling of aspiration and striving, where you want to learn this language that you are told is the language of the future. English is the language of moving up. So she's really striving to learn it, but she doesn't quite have it. And so I wanted this kind of non-standard English, which, is not the English of, blonde kids in picture books that like, you're told to read when you're a kid. But it is an English which settles very much into the depths of her own life. So I knew that I wanted to write her in that way. And there's another character who's a school teacher who becomes caught up in this political party's doing. Was third because I felt like I wanted this. I wanted the reader to see what he's doing critically, to have empathy and not make him a flat villain, but also to ask, well, is he holding on to his personal ethics? Is he surrendering them? Yeah. I think, this is so true of your book too, is that like so much of the sentence level work like carries the story forward. I really love how your book is able to operate as this like poetic, beautiful, like flow of sentences. But at the same time, there is a very like real velocity filled plot. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is that we've both written pretty plotty books. Can I ask for your thoughts on plot?
Yeah, actually curious to hear. I had this like little rant to a writer friend of mine recently, which is I feel like Megha, having both written fairly plotty books, I feel like we're actually living in this interesting age where people are not as interested in plot, or perhaps maybe that's not the right way to put it, but like some of the cool movement towards these like stream of consciousness novels, and I'm thinking like the Rachel Cutts trilogy, which, don't get me wrong, I adore, or Jenny Offal's work, which I also adored, and Lucy and Olive, or even this book called Rules of Distraction by Alexandra Chang, which came out earlier this year. And so for me, in the past couple of years, it's felt almost like that writing plot is either like uncool or like quietly. And I've been examining that thoughts in myself and in others, and there's a way in which I think like plot often intersects with genre literature or like less literary literature. But I know for myself, because I was taking from the tropes of the Western, which is very much like this like big, scheming, colorful genre, I think there's actually something very cool about taking lessons from genres that use plot more in the fore of the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about yourself in plot? Have you had these like sort of like mixed feelings about it as I have?
I kind of unashamedly love plot. I love plotty books. I love books that move. I think for me, plot feels like a way to really deeply examine a question. I think with this book, I wanted to ask this question of how people live in oppressive conditions. And these three distinct arcs and the plot helped me think about that question, and yeah, I mean, part of what I learned, which I've talked about elsewhere, is I also took inspiration from TV shows and this culture of like binge watching TV shows and being like, oh, you have to know what happens in a certain show from episode to episode. And that just felt like a sight of craft lessons to me. Like, how do you keep someone so invested in this made up story that they need to know what happens to these characters? So paying attention to pace and paying attention to how TV shows structure episodes, I found that really helpful.
I really love that. And I love that you, again, turned to something that wasn't literary fiction, like not the conventional sources for that. My own, like, a little confession is I used to write fan fiction. I spent like a lot of my high school and middle school years writing fan fiction. And I think that's really where, like, long before any official writing classes, I published my literary chops. And I think some of the lessons are probably like the lessons of TVs. It's like, how do you write actual cliffhangers? How do you write something where people want to keep reading and want to keep moving on to the next revelation or scene? I know, I can't tell if I'm frozen or if you are frozen, Megha.
Oh, I can see you. It doesn't look frozen to me. Does it look frozen to you?
Good again.
Okay, all right.
One moment.
I'm seeing a few people in the comments say that they're having trouble with the video and audio. I hope it's not frozen for everyone else, but we'll just carry on and hope it's watchable.
Okay. All right. I'm trying to see 1 second if I can, like, did I just disappear?
Oh.
Okay. All right. Well, I tried to
there
change.
You are.
So, thanks for bearing with us, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Shall we chat about having written broadly political books and how it feels to have written political books that are kind of landing in this moment? I know your book came out a couple months ago, Pam, but it was still, the same moment.
Yeah, it just has felt like one unending moment for a while. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your answer first, Megha, because it kind of seems from the way you talk about your book that you perhaps from the beginning sort of accepted that it was a political book or had something to say about the politics of the moment, where I think my own journey to sort of accepting that about my book was more fraught.
Okay, I'll go first. I guess for me, it feels very strange because I started writing this book several years ago, responding to what was happening in India and watching the news turn toward the right in India. And so to have the book published in a moment where there are such stunning parallels in the US, it feels really eerie. And one thing that I've been thinking about is, which some people watching might not know, is that there are really close links between Hindu nationalism and white supremacy. Like, they're both these hate-filled, xenophobic ideologies, which are based on, notions of a quote unquote pure race and fear of being replaced by other groups. And, so there are scholars and journalists doing work on this, so I won't go into it too much, but just to say that there are these really stunning parallels that I've been thinking about. And the book is also so much about, police brutality, but in a very different context. Like, I wrote about slum demolitions, which I remember reading about in the news when I was a kid. And so the reminder here feels like, just that these are old problems, these are old issues, and they have been with us in so many different forms, in vastly different places, and this kind of repetition of tragedies and repetition of traumas, which I think is not a stretch to say your book is interested in as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad you said that, because Meg, I think one of the really interesting things is like, I personally, like, I wrote my book. I didn't realize it was in response to anything. I started it in the beginning of 2015, right before the 2016 elections, before our current moment. But the question that I was really interested in, even at a moment in history that seemed really peaceful, relatively speaking, is how we as a culture often stumble into these moments that, as you say, feel repetitive, feel like they are some kind of reliving of the traumas of the past, because we don't address them. Frankly, if we don't address them, if they are lost from our collective memory, from our education, from our classrooms, which is, I think, a question you're interested in too, then where does that leave us? And so one of the questions that my book is interested in is actually like this question of like what gets to be placed into recorded history, which I think is just like a fascinating thing to think about today, especially as we I think all are beginning to look at the media and what makes it into the headlines with a little bit more scrutiny. Like whose story, right, has a right to be told, whose story is buried in surface. And like, we've heard of George Floyd, and some of us, not all of us, even have heard of Breonna Taylor. But right, like how many Black lives were lost because there wasn't a camera on them at the moment, or there wasn't a witness on them at the moment. And so it is really interesting to think of history as like what we see of it. I think it is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And
another aspect of your book, if I can bring it up, which feels very visibly political to me, and you gestured toward it a little while, is gender presentation. I felt like your book was so interested in that question. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. And I think it's another of those moments where I feel like I've said this a couple of times, is that as authors, I think we often, after the fact, manage to like make our intentions sound so much clearer than they were when we were writing. But for me, yeah, like I said, it was really important to have this gender non-conforming character be allowed to be themselves on the page first, without the label of a pronoun. And it's not that this character is like perfect in any way, but in some ways they are the person truest to themselves in this book, in which so many others are sort of having to mask their identity, or sort of having to compromise themselves ethically, as your characters do as well, Megha, to sort of like get where they want in this society that is built on inequity. And I know that you also have this character, Lovely, in your book, that sort of challenges at least what Westerners would consider conventional gender norms as well.
Yeah, so Lovely is a hijra. It's a very complex social category in India, which, falls at the intersections of gender, religion, class, and Lovely belongs to this community where, in some ways, she is considered to have this close connection to the divine. So her blessings are much sought after, and people want her to bless their newborn and want her to bless, couples who are just getting married. But on the other hand, she is also reviled. She is looked down upon, and she earns a living in part by begging on trains and in the streets. And so, like you, I wanted to write this character who, despite existing at the intersection of all of these different kinds of marginalization, is still so true to themselves. And I wanted to write a character who would have this kind of joyous, defiant, humor-filled arc where she refuses to accept the shame that society wants to burden her with.
Yeah, and she definitely does that, and that comes through on the page. And I think it is really interesting, because I think that often when people think about politics and fiction, right, some people have this immediate reaction where like, oh no, that just sounds so dry and boring. But I think that probably the way that you and I probably think about it is like the best political fiction is fiction where the characters aren't coming, like coming out of a stance, but the characters are allowed to step to the fore. And as an author, it's like doing your duty by that character first, where even that character may not be perfect, right? Because characters are so much more compelling that way. The character may not fully and should not fully represent everybody in the category that they are a part of. But when they're brought to life in that imperfect, flawed, and interesting way, that's what compels people to read and understand that story, and perhaps like be curious about other stories like that.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. Can I ask you, here's something that I've really been meaning to ask you, is writing a second book or a next book, are you doing it, or how are you doing it?
Oh man, it's such a loaded question in these times, especially. I've had this, I think as writers, we've had this conversation put to us a lot since sort of shelter in place began across the country, where people are like, wow, isn't this the perfect time to start your next project? Are you writing? And I've gotten on a little bit of a soapbox about this personally, where I like really hate that pressure being put on writers, because I think that this isn't a time of relaxation for anyone. This is like a time of unrest and anxiety and putting a lot of our energies elsewhere at the moment. And for me, what's been really helpful is to kind of broaden my definition of writing, and to think about the fact that we often see writing pretty narrowly as, I'm sitting down at the computer, I'm going like clickety clack, but writing is actually so often living in the world. It's like it is going to a protest. It is like calling your mom. It is sitting in like silence with a grieving friend. It is all these lived experiences that I think you need to digest and process and then bring back to the page later. But that was just a fancy way of saying I'm not writing, and I'm okay with that. But what about you?
That's so beautiful about living, though. I totally think that what you're making me think of right now is how before I arrived at this book and before I felt that I had to write this book, my writing felt like so much playing and so much tinkering, like I was kind of just playing with language, and I didn't feel that I had any contribution to make to the world, or I didn't have anything to say about the world. And so much of it was just living and being in the world and gathering these experiences and paying attention, like having that outward attention to what's happening so that you can then begin to form your thoughts on it and respond to it in a way that you are able to be proud of. I am writing very, very slowly. I was actually, I had a chat with Britt Bennett yesterday, and I was asking her for advice, and something she said really struck me, which she said that, when you publish a first book, there's this burst of attention. But then in order to get back to your writing, I think she said something like, you have to bring yourself back to that private place and that place of solitude where you don't believe that anybody will look at your work, like kind of how we wrote our books, I think, with no expectations and, no agent and no editor, and just being alone with your pages. And I think I'm trying to do some of that, but of course it definitely feels like a time to engage with the world and participate and contribute and do what we can too.
Yeah, I think that writing is also, it's important for me to remember that like we are accustomed to living our daily lives on a frankly capitalist clock, right? The idea of a work week, the idea of like days needing to be split into hours and the year being in quarters and seasons of this sort, that's a very capitalist notion. And it's really not the clock by which writing or any creative work really runs at all. And there are definitely, I know there are writers who sit down to write every day, but I think even those writers will tell you that sure, you may labor over like hundreds of pages every day for 2 years, but sometimes that's the stuff you throw away. And sometimes it is the writing that you get in a burst that stays. So
yeah,
there's that.
absolutely. I know that we will open up questions in a few minutes, but first, Pam, should we talk about a couple books we love and offer a few book recommendations?
Yes,
okay. So let's do that, and then we'll go to questions if anybody watching has a question and wants to pop it into that Ask a Question button. Should I go first with my book rec? Or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, all right. I have a couple books here. I wanted to recommend this book that I really love. It's called We Need New Names. It's by No Violet Bulawayo. And I think it was pitched as a novel, but in my mind, it kind of lives as connected short stories. But either way, it's just a really powerful, beautiful book. And this came to mind today, Pam, because I was thinking about Sam and Lucy in your book. And I think this book also has such compelling, beautifully written, kind of cheeky, sarcastic, bold children. And it's hard to write children in that complex way. So this is a book that I really love. And just to highlight a book that I hadn't heard too much about, but it looks fantastic. It just arrived, so I'm going to read it next. It's called The Alchemy of Us, and this is a nonfiction book. And it's a book which highlights inventors of color, which I definitely think we need more stories like that. And it's by a writer, Anissa Ramirez, which I'm super excited to read. And like Pam and I said at the beginning, reading is great, reading is vital, but everything else you can at this moment. I'll just shout out a mutual aid network that I've been contributing to here in New York. It's called Bed-Stuy Strong. And just today, actually, I read this really powerful essay written. Her name is Sarah Thankam Matthews, and she wrote this essay about how she just decided to start it, and then lots of people joined, and I think it said it has 3,000 members right now. It's a really powerful and frank essay about starting this mutual aid network. So I encourage you to contribute to it if you can, or find mutual aid networks wherever you live.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I actually just donated to Bed-Stuy Strong like a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
It's such a cool organization. So for my books, I think Megha and I were also just like really interested in highlighting some Black writers in this time and place. So 2 books I want to call out are this book called Lakewood by Megan Giddings that just came out earlier this year. And it's about this young Black woman who, because of financial straits, ends up taking this job to have medical experiments performed on her. And it is this absolutely chilling and captivating book that I think just like lives in this slippery territory between like realism, but also horror, but also kind of sci-fi, but also not, because these things have happened in our country and are probably still happening. And, it's also really interested in these questions of like, just like economic hardship and health insurance. And it's just like deeply topical and strange and weird. And if you need to read a book that will kind of keep you up at night, this one is one of those. And I also want to call out Real Life by Brandon Taylor, which also came out this year. And this one is about a young Black graduate student in a program for the sciences. And it is just like so good at this quietly beautiful and devastating portrayal of just like life on the margins when you're uncomfortable in your body, when you're moving through the world and people don't really see you, how you navigate friendships and love and relationships. And the writing is just really, really stunning. And, I just want to take this moment to say, yes, give to the mutual aid networks, buy these books. Like I personally, my publicist is on this and she probably won't like that I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say my book has been out for a couple of months. Like, there's like a time and a place for reading books, but like if you have limited funds, as I'm sure many of you do, I would say buy Megha's book. It just came out. It's amazing. Buy one of these books by Block authors. Donate. You do not need to buy my book. You can buy it later, or you can check it out from your local library or whatever. Truly, I really mean that. And then if you do end up buying my book, I will match proceeds from it up to $250 for Act Blue. So, but truly, buy these other books first. Anyways, that's the last thing I'll say about that.
I did not know you were going to say that. That was not in our prep notes.
Anyways, open it up for questions.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we have some questions. First from Raksha, she says, did the final version of your books differ from what you conceived when you first started writing? And how did those changes come about?
I can go first since I probably had more time to think about my answer to this question. The structure of my book, the beginning and the ending, were always the same from the beginning. And I think this comes from this place where books just pop into my head as a series of images. In this case, I had a first and a last. So the writing process was really about connecting the dots. And to Megha and I's earlier conversation about writing being sort of taken off the normal clock. I actually wrote the first chapter of this book as a short story and did not want to or intend to write a novel, but the characters kind of just kept banging around in my head after I finished the short story. And so for me, it was really this process of letting the characters announce themselves in my brain and feel really, really urgent before I sat down and wrote the first draft, which, looks like it happened in a brief period of time, but really I think is an extension of all the thinking and living time that I had with it. So the structure of the book is the same, but every sentence has been rewritten dozens and dozens of times.
I think for me, I had the three people. I spent a lot of time figuring out how their arcs would end. I reworked where they would go. I don't want to give away too much, but there were questions of how far would I follow them? Where would I also had this kind of symmetry in mind, which I hope will make sense if you have a chance to read the book that I was working with. So I did not have a closing image, which Pam, that sounds fascinating that you have a starting image and a closing image. I definitely worked on where to leave the characters. I think that was a lot of my question. Is I kind of knew at some point where I wanted their lives to go, but I didn't know where to leave them and where would be meaningful to leave them. So that was a lot of what I worked on.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is from Beth, and she asks, who do you each hope your stories reach the most?
I'll go first again, but my answer to that has changed a little bit. I think my ambition for this book has changed, and what I mean by that is, at first, I think Megha was sort of talking about this need to go into the private place as a writer, which really resonates with me. And so at first the book was really just for myself, because growing up, I never saw a book like this, and I wanted it. And then slowly the answer changed to be I hope this book is for, other Asian Americans who have felt some of the feelings of sort of loneliness and displacement that the characters feel. And I think that my answer to that has changed still more, such that I'm I wrote this book to be a great American epic. It is as much in the tradition of Steinbeck and Mary McMurtry as it is in the tradition of Asian American literature. And it shouldn't, everyone should be able to read this book, and in just the way that I grew up reading books about white families. And those are American books that I could identify with. So I've been sort of emboldened along this path, and
I love it. For me, I think I'm so surprised that the book has any interest in the US because it is set entirely in India. And when I was writing it, I didn't know if anybody here would be interested in such a story. So now I really hope that the book is legible and inviting to somebody who doesn't follow Indian politics, has never been to India, about following your dreams and loving whom you love and living with morals and deciding what to do